We're here in the Big Creek National Wildlife Area, and we're standing in a Phragmites stand. This is a European plant that is overtaking this area, and unfortunately, the density of these stands is so significant that wildlife cannot survive. Dead adult blooming Serta. We need to find a large-scale solution to get rid of this invasive plant. Without a large-scale solution, I do fear that our turtle species and many of our other wildlife species that use the Long Point Biosphere Reserve will be lost.
Ecologists believe the vast wetlands of Long Point in Ontario have about 5 years before they are completely taken over by the invasive plant Phragmites. To anyone walking through a 15-foot-tall stand of frag, the problem seems almost unstoppable. But the people here at the Long Point Biosphere Reserve have faced a series of dire environmental challenges in the past and have somehow always come up with ambitious local solutions for how to solve them. The question this time is, can a solution be found in time to stop one of Canada's most important wetlands from being transformed into a dead zone? Biosphere reserves are regions of global ecological significance that make an ongoing commitment to the United Nations to strive for sustainability. They are not parks, and they have no legal authority. They are places where people are inspired to find ways to live and work in harmony with nature. This series explores what's happening in Canada's biosphere reserves, the successes and the challenges of people determined to create a sustainable future for their communities. Come with us on a coast-to-coast adventure spanning thousands of years. It just might change the way you think about the environment and our place in it. Reptile biologist Scott Gillingwater has been assessing turtle and snake populations in the wetlands of Long Point for more than a decade.
Got one. Female blandings. You know, I've always rooted for the underdog, and I think turtles and snakes are the ultimate underdogs. Carapace width is 141. In 2003, when I began doing, I guess, a larger scale mark recapture program for turtles, I noticed that there were some small patches of Phragmites or European reed in this area. And now, 12 years later, areas that only had patches maybe 10 foot by 10 foot are now overtaking hundreds of acres of wetland.
Phragmites has been spreading across the wetlands of Ontario since the late 1940s. But its recent expansion into the Long Point Biosphere Reserve is especially tragic.
If you look at the landscape across southwestern Ontario, we've unfortunately removed a lot of natural areas. We've drained wetlands, we've cut down forest, and we're left with a lot of barren landscapes where these animals can't survive. But here in the Long Point Biosphere Reserve, we have extensive areas of natural habitat. It's a refuge for animals that can't exist outside of some of these areas.
In many ways, the Long Point region is a natural sanctuary in an otherwise heavily developed southern Ontario, which led Long Point to be declared as Canada's third UNESCO Biosphere Reserve in 1986. Few people know what makes Long Point special better than Brian Craig, president of the local Biosphere Reserve Foundation.
Long Point itself is the largest freshwater sand spit in the world. The marshes at Long Point are extremely important for staging for waterfowl. And just as important, we have about 30% forest cover of Carolinian forest, with one of the largest blocks of old-growth forest, some people say within 1,000 miles, definitely within Canada, that being Backus Woods. And there are some trees in there that are over 500 years old.
Sharing this natural oasis are about 60,000 people, most of whom live on the agricultural land surrounding the point. But a single road, the Long Point Causeway, connects the mainland to a cottage community of about 500 at the base of the point.
Blessed with nature, our community wants to look after it, to nurture it, and at the same time have a vibrant economy.
One of the major contributors to the economy of Long Point is bird watching. And if you're a birder, few places are more famous than the tip of Long Point, home to North America's first bird observatory.
Well, you're at the tip of Long Point. It's really the last true wilderness left in southern Ontario. There's no roads, you can only get here by boat, and it's secluded, so that's what makes it good for the birds. And the checklist stands at 399 species, so the 400th could be right behind us right now. The Long Point Bird Observatory was founded on volunteers, and it really does draw people from around the world. We've hosted individuals from over 80 countries here on Long Point.
Yeah.
A busy day on the tip. We are actually opening nets at 5:30 a.m. just before dawn. We run the nets for a standard 6 hours.
Sometimes on good days we've banded over 500 birds in one day, and it was just bird, bird, bird. You pick one bird out of the net, you look back, there's 5 others in the net. So it was just constant going. It was very exciting.
And either this year or next year, Long Point Bird Observatory itself will band its millionth bird.
With over 300 species monitored, every species tells its own story, and probably the most notable example of how birds can tell us what's going on in the environment is the DDT in the 60s and 70s, which decimated populations of most raptors, but the effects of DDT were felt even in American robins. So birds showed us the warning signs, the canaries in the coal mine, and then we were able to reverse the problem.
So there's a great value in developing citizen science, and also you're building it into the culture as well, so people actually care more for their environment, not just their birds.
Long Point's one of Canada's best kept secrets, and the birds are only part of it. Long Point itself has a special draw, and it sucks certain people in, and once it holds onto you, you can't let go.
Visitors to Long Point today would likely be surprised to learn that it wasn't always a natural oasis. Hard-won lessons and great human effort have gone into safeguarding this landscape of sand. For 5,000 years, a westerly wind has been eroding the sandy cliffs of Lake Erie to build the point. But without vegetation, this fragile terrain quite literally blows away. Tom Meulendyk, a geoscientist from the University of Toronto, has been using ground-penetrating radar to study how the point was formed and what's holding it together.
The dunes are the backbone of Long Point Spit, so we really wanted to figure out how they were building and how they'd grown over time. So that's why we came here with the radar. We're finding that the trees play a really critical role in how the dunes grow. So initially, these cottonwoods send their seeds out in the spring, and these become sort of fence-like obstructions that the sand collects around, whereas a lot of trees will die off. The cottonwoods sort of flourish as sand accumulates around them. So over time, sand builds up and you end up with a long shore-parallel dune. We've also seen within the radar profiles that some of these dunes have large collapses within them, and the dunes sort of falling in on themselves. So Long Point is a very fragile environment. I mean, these dunes, anytime they can just be picked up and blown away. So it's really important that you have vegetation here. Their roots hold everything together.
Long Point is so fragile that 5 people walking in a row on a sand dune can damage the vegetation enough to permanently impact the point. How a 40-kilometer beach in Canada's most populated region has remained largely intact despite being so fragile can be traced back to the 1850s, when the very existence of the point was in peril.
I guess it was gearing up to be a tragedy of the commons. It was overlogged and overused and overharvested, and there were prize fights and bordellos and all kinds of things going on out there.
There were brothels established. The women would come in from Buffalo primarily. A good many Americans were coming over and just doing whatever they felt like.
A lot of people back in the 1800s and early 1900s, their employment was hunting for commercial purposes. So they would go out, and obviously they're trying to harvest as many of whatever they're harvesting as possible because they're trying to make a profit. And that's where they had, big punt guns, and where they would, sneak in close to big flocks of waterfowl. And as soon as they start to lift, they'd shoot anything from nails and glass and everything in there, trying to maximize the kill so they could take them to market.
And the government had no way of controlling it. They weren't about to try and police it.
Because it was so difficult to police Long Point, the government put it up for sale with the hope that somebody else would look after it. It took a while to find a buyer, but in 1866, virtually the entire point was sold to a group of wealthy recreational hunters known as the Long Point Company, arguably Canada's first hunting club.
They were hard-headed businessmen, and they wanted it just for the recreation, duck hunting primarily, and so they set up regulations, and they were pretty astute because they hired the worst poachers as their keepers, paid them to keep others off.
The Long Point Company protected that sand spit from development. Otherwise, it probably would have eroded away, or it would have been all cottage development, and it wouldn't be what it is today.
In the 1970s, the Long Point Company donated 8,000 acres to the Canadian government for the creation of Ontario's largest national wildlife area. And this fragile part of the Biosphere Reserve is now off-limits to hunters and all other members of the public without special permission from the Canadian Wildlife Service. Hunting is allowed in accordance with the provincial regulations in some of Long Point's marshes. True to Long Point's roots, hunters continue to contribute time and money to conserve and enhance the wetlands of Long Point.
The great thing about that is the money that we as hunters put into wildlife conservation, it benefits a whole suite of non-hunted species because we're providing habitat that's not specific to ducks, it's specific to wetland-dependent wildlife.
One species that is not hunted but benefits from the protected habitat of Long Point is the tundra swan. Every year, Long Point Waterfowl, a research organization funded by hunters, participates in a population survey of the swans.
25 adults.
Okay. Caitlin Weaver is a biologist who completed her master's degree studying the habitat use of tundra swans in partnership with Long Point Waterfowl.
I grew up as, one of those kids that just absolutely despised hunting and thought it was this terrible thing. And as I got older, I started kind of doing a lot more volunteering and seeing the different species and seeing how habitat management might sometimes be much more economical by having hunters a part of it. And that's one of the things I think that Long Point is so great for, because we have the opportunity to see all the birds coming through here and being able to see the relationship between the hunters and the conservation here.
At the end of the day, if it wasn't for hunting, you might not even have a biosphere here. The wetlands were protected because of hunting. They continue to be protected because of hunting.
Just as remarkable and fragile as the Long Point sand spit itself are the Carolinian forests on the adjacent mainland. The Biosphere Reserve is home to what's arguably the highest natural cover in southern Ontario and is a last bastion for the dwindling Carolinian ecozone in Canada. This ecologically diverse region makes up less than 1% of Canada's land area, yet supports the highest human density in the country, which is also why it's home to a third of Canada's species at risk. One indicator of a healthy Carolinian forest is an abundance of salamanders. And for nearly 2 decades, Jim Wilson and his son Nick have volunteered to monitor salamanders in Backus Woods, which is perhaps the best remaining mature Carolinian forest in Canada.
It's something that a lot of people don't know about. You find quite a variety here.
Salamanders actually breathe through their skin, so salamanders are a good indicator of the amount of pollution in the forests.
So by monitoring their populations, they could be a good indicator of any stresses in the environment.
3-6.
Jim is a mechanic and Nick is a teacher, and they started working together to monitor salamanders when Nick participated in a biosphere camp here as a child. Over the next 20 years, they created one of the largest data sets for salamanders in North America.
Don't see very often.
Around the world, they've noticed declines in reptile populations and amphibian populations. Our populations have stayed fairly stable, but if we can have any early indication of changes happening, we want to be able to pick up on that as quick as possible. Because I grew up in the area and it's one of my favorite places to come back to, I wanted to be here for, my kids and future generations. So spending a little bit of my extra time here is worthwhile.
Jim and Nick are part of a long line of conservationists that have learned how important it is to look after this rare and fragile landscape. It's hard to imagine today, but Backus Woods was once an island in a heavily degraded natural environment.
Norfolk County now is called Ontario's Garden. Well, it was Ontario's desert at one time.
The forests of the mainland had grown slowly upon huge sand deposits, just like the point. But where the point was protected by the hunting community before too much damage could be done, the first European settlers on the mainland were actually required by law to clear trees for farming.
So by hook or by crook, they cut, they burned. That was their requirement in order to get ownership of the land.
Once you cleared too big a piece of ground, then the wind took over, and on a windy spring day, you'd lose topsoil. Of course, once the topsoil was gone, and it wasn't very deep anyway, the farm became barely productive enough to support a family.
People had to leave the land. They just had to go. When you see the pictures of what was left of their farms, it was terrible. Many families were broken up and left.
After a few years of use, many settlers could no longer live off the land here. And the loss of habitat meant that some animal species, like the wild turkey, were eliminated from the region by the early 1900s. It was not long after the turkeys disappeared that Walter McCall, a local furniture maker, decided that enough was enough. Not only was Walter having to go farther and farther afield to find lumber, the desert was literally closing in on him with one of the worst wasteland areas right across the road from his mill. McCall refused to believe that nothing could be done about the problem. As an experiment, he planted a few saplings near his mill and invited Edmund Zavitz, a forestry professor with a cottage in nearby Turkey Point, to come and have a look. Inspired by what he saw, Zavitz helped McCall convince the provincial government to purchase 100 acres of wasteland near McCall's mill and start the St. William's Forestry Station.
This station really was the first real hands-on conservation measure that was executed in the province of Ontario.
Zavitz put a team together and they got to work almost immediately. Using tree branches and old tree stumps as protection against the blowing sand, they planted 350,000 pine and spruce tree seeds, along with several thousand white pine seedlings shipped all the way from Germany. With a great deal of care and attention, a field of seedlings began to grow out of the sand. Much to everyone's surprise, the young trees never blew away, and the foresters collected their pine cones and developed a drying process to remove the seeds, which were planted and grown into more seedlings. Zavitz had not only figured out a process that worked to reforest the desert lands, but he could give seedlings to others who wanted to do the same. Soon, armed with millions of seedlings, the staff at the forestry station tried to entice local farmers to do just that.
For years, they gave trees to farmers who would plant the sandplane and plant windbreaks as well, which were really important.
The forestry station did more than just provide farmers with free trees. They also showed farmers how they could make a profit off their new forests through selective harvesting. This proved to be a winning combination.
When you see the pictures on the wall here of the gatherings that they had right here at the station. Hundreds of people, all dressed up in their best outfits, coming to the station to hear a presentation about conservation. That's pretty impressive.
Well, our first car was a 27 Nash, and on Sundays after church we'd bug Dad to go for a drive. We'd often go for a picnic, and very often end up at the reforestry station. And of course, if you get a bundle of trees free, why, you're going to find a place to put them. Through the reforestry farm, there were thousands of acres actually planted by farmer volunteers. It had a tremendous effect.
By the 1930s, the St. William's Forestry Station had reforested 4,000 acres of degraded land. And by the time it was privatized in 1998, it had shipped over 300 million seedlings. But while the forestry station played a critical role in fixing the region's environmental woes, there was something else going on at the same time. Local farmers had discovered that these sandy soils were perfect for growing a particularly high-value crop, tobacco.
Tobacco is just a weed. All it needs is something to prop it up, and you fertilize it and you get a great crop of tobacco. So it was an ideal crop for the sand plain. And it brought in more money than any other crop you could think of.
Farmers now had a good economic reason to stay and look after their lands. So between the reforestation efforts and the tobacco farmers, southern Ontario's desert grew into productive farms surrounded by expansive forests. But there is one place here in the Long Point Biosphere Reserve that didn't need any restoration. At Backus Woods, 500-year-old trees have stood as the surrounding woodlands have turned from forest to desert and back again. And this despite the fact that the original owners of this property, the Backus family, were millers and lumbermen. The Backus family moved to the region in the late 1700s, but instead of clear-cutting their land, they kept their forest healthy and productive over many generations by selectively harvesting trees in a way that's similar to the sustainable forest practices of today.
I would be hard-pressed to identify where in the family line a sense of continuity or a sense of preservation began to develop. I believe the overriding influence perhaps is the fact that the family were in one spot for over 150 years, that the family were connected to their land as their sense of income, with the understanding that if you take care of the land will take care of you. And although my generation are not as connected to our land, we all still feel that root. We still feel that connectivity that pulls us back.
It was through the efforts of the St. William's Forestry Station that the rest of the region slowly learned to treat this fragile landscape with the same care that the Backus family always had. So as the natural cover in most of southern Ontario disappeared throughout the 20th century, here at Long Point, it actually increased. But the people of Long Point didn't stop with reforestation. As habitats improved over the decades, some residents wondered if the region's historic biodiversity could also be restored.
My grandfather, my great-grandfather, they never knew of turkeys because they were already gone, and we've brought them back.
The Ministry of Natural Resources was collaborating with hunters to bring the wild turkey back to Ontario in the early 80s. And the newly reforested Long Point region looked like the perfect spot to start their reintroduction. The first turkeys were brought up from the United States in 1984 and released in Backus Woods. Dave Reid was a biologist with the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources at the time.
We hoped for the best, and it succeeded beyond our wildest dreams, really.
The turkeys released at Long Point multiplied rapidly, and their offspring were transported to other parts of Ontario. There are now more than 100,000 birds in the province, making Ontario's wild turkey reintroduction one of the most successful wildlife recoveries in Canadian history. It was in 1986, amidst the reintroduction of the wild turkey to Long Point, that the region was designated as a biosphere reserve by UNESCO. Dave was one of the early Biosphere board members, and he believes that using a region's natural resources is key to its sustainability.
The way I've always viewed it is, if you use something, like if you're a fisherman and you use the lake to catch your fish in, or you like to hunt and you like to hunt turkeys, well, you want to be able to do that forever. And you're going to want to conserve it and ensure that it's there for you and for future generations. So that's, I think, the concept of the biosphere.
A 100 years of conservation efforts have made the Long Point Biosphere Reserve very important to environmental groups like the Nature Conservancy of Canada, also known as the NCC. To the NCC, protecting land in the Long Point region is the best way to ensure the survival of Canada's tiny Carolinian ecozone. To date, the Nature Conservancy of Canada has conserved about 5,000 acres here, including Backus Woods.
The Long Point area has these core natural building blocks that we can build on. And by investing here, protecting those cores and building on them, restoring habitat to make them larger and more connected, has really been the best investment for NCC in terms of conserving Carolinian Canada.
Landowners like the NCC still turn to the Forestry Station, now a private company called the St. William's Nursery and Ecology Centre, for help with land restoration. But a great deal has been learned about restoration since the 1920s. At the time, the goal was to stabilize the soil by planting a monoculture of fast-growing trees, many of which were not native to southern Ontario.
In the get-go, it was really to reforest land that was otherwise turning into wasteland. And now we've really evolved in trying to restore biodiversity as opposed to just a few species of trees.
So instead of just planting trees, the St. William's Nursery and Ecology Centre is now helping landowners like the Nature Conservancy of Canada restore some of the diverse habitats that once existed here.
NCC acquired this property about 5 years ago. It was formerly a farm. The field that's behind me has been restored with about 50 to 80 different species of wildflowers and prairie grasses and tree seeds and shrubs.
One of the big changes in restoration practice is the planting of native prairie grasses first, before planting trees.
When we're looking at tall grass prairie systems, we usually think of the great expanses of prairie that's going to be in the middle of the United States and in the southern and middle portions of Canada. But prairie grasses are an integral part of this landscape. And it's really good to get these very large grasses to establish because they have very large rooting systems. They can reduce the amount of erosion and the environment can stabilize and soils can build and develop.
Part of this property was set aside by the NCC for Dr. Brian Ohsowski's research on improving the survival of native prairie grass on sand barrens. Funded by the Ontario aggregate industry, Brian's work can be applied not only to the sandy soils of Long Point, but also to the rehabilitation of former sand quarries.
When we're looking at a sand pit, we're missing all of the important elements that make soil soil. So we're trying to change the soil conditions to be more favorable to grow these native plants.
Brian is experimenting with soil conditioners like compost and biochar, a charcoal-like substance created by roasting organic material in the absence of oxygen.
Biochar is quite interesting because prairies are regularly burned, and the plants that are here are actually very adapted to being burned periodically. So we are thinking that the addition of the biochar is a natural component to this landscape.
Although Brian's work is ongoing, he believes that a combination of compost and biochar mixed into degraded sandy soils will enhance the growth of native grasses.
It will take a very long time for the native plant communities to recover, and we wouldn't necessarily look at these highly impacted sand systems as being native, high biodiversity, tall grass prairie ecosystems. But we're placing it on a trajectory.
Many believe that the final step to restore Long Point's ecosystem is to connect the dots, to create natural corridors between forested areas, allowing wildlife to move freely throughout the region.
Okay, who wants these trees? Me. Okay, well, I'll put it in this bucket here first.
Can I get extra trees?
Extra trees.
Is it deep enough? Check it.
This is our annual scout planting day, and they usually plant anywhere between 2,000 and 4,000 trees.
Ontario Power Generation provides the Long Point Conservation Authority with trees as part of the Ontario Power Generation Forest Corridor project. More than 1 million trees have been planted so far, restoring over 1,000 acres in a bid to connect Carolinian forest blocks in the Biosphere Reserve.
You got it, bud? NCC owns the land, and what we do is we try to achieve the same goals as NCC. We try to beef up existing forest tracts. As you can see, we've got a wood lot over here and a wood lot back here and one across the road, so we're actually filling a gap here. What I enjoy about it is the kids not only get to plant some trees and get to learn a little bit about restoration and tree planting, but they also just get outside. So it's a great opportunity for them to enjoy nature, and hopefully they carry that through their life.
Surrounded by 100-year-old trees planted by their ancestors as part of Canada's first major reforestation effort, these kids are following in some pretty big footsteps. It's something of which Paul Gagnon, who has worked on this project for 14 years, is keenly aware.
It's hard to compete with what they did, but I'd like to think that we're learning from what they've learned and we're utilizing that information and maybe adding a little bit to it.
The foresters of 100 years ago weren't thinking of climate change, but today ecologists like Paul are designing their restoration efforts to maximize the amount of carbon that's captured or sequestered from the atmosphere during the process.
Through the planting of prairie grass, right off the bat, what happens is it starts to sequester carbon right away, whereas the trees may sit for the first 2 or 3 years and not sequester much at all. And as the prairie keeps sequestering the carbon, the trees start to come on, and then it starts to shade out the prairie, so you actually maximize that carbon sequestration with those different species.
Thanks to restoration efforts old and new, Long Point continues to close in on the 30% natural cover that many ecologists believe is crucial for maintaining both biodiversity and ecological goods and services like clean air and water. And true to the spirit of a biosphere reserve, this has been achieved not in spite of human use, but because of it. Although, as with everything in this land of sand, what's been achieved here is fragile. Only a small percentage of land is protected by government and the Nature Conservancy of Canada. The rest is in the hands of farmers who live in a delicate balance with the region's sandy soils.
I think people in this area are occasionally reminded of the wastelands of the past and the effects of deforestation, but it is fairly easy to forget when you see all the forested lands and all the windbreaks that are now on the landscape.
Early reforestation success hinged on the high-value tobacco crop, which gave farmers a reason to stay on the land and plant hedgerows and woodlots to control blowing sand. But in 2009, the Ontario government dismantled the tobacco quota system, and since then some farmers have turned to crops that require much larger acreages to be profitable.
Quite frankly, with all the farms going from 100 acres to 1,000, I'm concerned that we're going to go through the whole thing again.
We are getting such big machines in our fields that people are starting to take down the windbreaks that were planted, and I think there's going to be a day that we're going to see more damage again.
We never seem to learn.
While some farmers may be forgetting the past, others are embracing its lessons as they shape a new future. Steve and Anita Buehner are repurposing their tobacco farm, Bonnie Heath, into a lavender farm, winery, and agritourism destination.
In 2009, the government put us out of business, basically, and told us to create something new with our lives. Lavender grows very well in well-draining soil, which is something that was very similar to the tobacco soil types. So we knew that lavender could be grown successfully here in Norfolk County. We also were involved with a group of local grape growers that were looking at establishing wineries in the area.
To help turn their farm into an agritourism destination, Anita and Steve have worked closely with Alternative Land Use Services, or ALICE, which provides funding to farmers willing to transform some of their land into natural habitats.
This has always been one of my examples of the resiliency of the Norfolk County farmer. This used to be a beautiful tobacco farm, and the Buehner family took their farming operation into a different direction, and they gave some of the farm back to Mother Nature through the ALICE program.
With ALICE's help, the Buehners created a wetland on a low part of their property, and to stop erosion, they converted 20 acres of marginal land into tall grass prairie. Prairies need to be burned in order to be maintained, and Tallgrass Ontario, a charity dedicated to the maintenance of Ontario's remaining prairie habitats, has come to Bonnie Heath to orchestrate a prescribed burn.
Here today, our goal is to consume the biomass that's on the site and do it in a safe manner. The prairie is a natural fire-dependent ecosystem.
If you leave these prairies alone, eventually they're going to turn back into woods, into forests. So burning it keeps the young saplings and the invasive species out of it, so it keeps it a healthy prairie.
We have now witnessed the immediate results of that burn in that our prairie grasses are looking much healthier. The wildflowers are much more abundant.
If you dig down in there, the whole thing is moving. It's alive with the native pollinators that most people don't even realize exist. And we try to enhance that type of habitat and give the pollinators a good place to live and a good start in life, and then they can go do the work for us farmers and pollinate the crops.
Transition is really tough, but Steve and I are thrilled with the direction our farm has gone. We love the environmental projects. That wetland now is part of a walking tour that we've established in our agritourism business, along with the prairie grasses, which add beauty to the farm as well as providing environmental benefits. The projects have contributed greatly to our business here.
Within the Biosphere Reserve, we have intensive agriculture next door to some of the most environmentally fragile areas in the whole country. And I think at ALICE we recognize you still have to eat, and the food comes from the farms, but maybe we can give those marginal little fringes back to Mother Nature, and we'll continue our intensive agriculture on the prime stuff that's left over.
There's a place for people and there's a place for nature to be protected as well, and trying to find that balance is an ongoing challenge.
In the Long Point Biosphere Reserve, nowhere is the challenge of balancing the needs of people and nature greater than the Long Point Causeway. While the majority of the point was protected by the Long Point Company, the base of the point became a people place, home to a cottage community and a provincial park. A causeway connects the mainland to the community, cutting right through critical wildlife habitats. A 2005 study identified this road as one of the deadliest in North America for amphibians and reptiles, killing almost 10,000 animals every year. It's a problem of which biologist Scott Gillingwater is acutely aware.
In order to protect and recover a lot of these threatened species, we need to retain the adult population. And we were finding in some days multiple adult animals were being lost along the causeway. So this is devastating not only to turtle researchers, but to the population itself. Without large numbers of adult animals, you're going to have a population crash. So myself and Paul Ashley from the Canadian Wildlife Service decided to get a group of like-minded individuals together to see what could be done to prevent turtles from getting killed along the road.
This group of like-minded individuals included longtime cottager Rick Levick.
If they can't exist in a World Biosphere Reserve beside a national wildlife area, they don't have a chance anywhere else. So we felt that, hey, this is a place where this may be these animals' last stand. So let's do something about it.
The first thing the Causeway Improvement Project did was launch an education campaign to let people know how big the problem was and to encourage them to carefully help turtles across the road. Next, they installed nearly 5 kilometers of fencing along the road, which is not an easy task in the low-lying marshes of Long Point. But the work paid off, having an almost immediate impact on road mortality.
Within just 3 years, we reduced the roadkill by over 50% and over 60% for the species at risk.
But the fencing created another problem.
So by putting the fencing and keeping them off the road, we're preventing them from moving through the habitat that's on one side of the road or the other. So we wanted to correct that problem by putting passageways or culverts underneath the road, and then they could pass back and forth as their life cycle required.
So far, the Long Point community has raised more than $2 million to install 10 specially designed wildlife culverts. The culverts are reconnecting terrestrial and aquatic habitats that have been disrupted for decades due to the causeway. To see if the wildlife culverts are working, Rick has enlisted the help of McMaster University biologist Chantal Markle.
So where my project fits in is looking at, do the turtles actually use the culverts? The first year we had 30 Blandings turtles that were a part of the project. I got him. This Blandings has been a part of our study since last year, and so he has 2 tags that are just glued onto the back of his shell here. The first is the radio tag and then the pit tag. And the pit tag is the tag that works with the antennas that are set up at the entrance to the culvert, so we can tell whether he's using the culverts or not. So every week we download the data, and so it's always kind of exciting to see, like, was there any turtles using it? So the first turtle that we had, the tag was logged multiple times, so we could tell that the turtle was actually just sitting in the opening of the culvert as if to be like, do I really want to go through this? Like, this is new. And then he did actually go all the way through. And then when he came back to the marsh later in the year, he used the same culvert again, and it was just 1 data point was logged, so we knew that he just swam right through the culvert. We had 2 turtles that used it last year out of the 30, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's actually a really encouraging result because the other turtles that didn't use the culvert actually weren't spending time very close to the road, and they didn't try to cross the road. But because we now have the fencing in the culverts, those 2 turtles that wanted to go in that area were able to do so safely.
For me, whenever I drive across the causeway, my eyes are scanning the road to see if there's anything been killed on the road. And if I get to the end of the causeway and I see nothing on the road, it's a really good day.
I'm very happy with the success of our efforts so far along the causeway. We've seen drastic reductions in wildlife mortality, but we've also seen many in the community come together to help support it. However, there are other factors that result in the decline of reptiles and turtles in particular. And over the past 10 years, I've seen major areas of the Long Point Biosphere Reserve that have been lost to an invasive plant species called Phragmites.
And I think one of the problems we had with one of the culverts that we put in and the animals not using it is that there was a huge stand of Phragmites quite close by, and they really couldn't pass through that Phragmites stand to access the culvert.
Steve Armstrong and his crew have been responsible for maintaining the wildlife fences along the causeway for the past 7 years. And Phragmites has been making their job increasingly difficult.
It is a nightmare. To tell you the honest truth, to tell you that we've figured it out, we haven't figured it out because it's so tough. Like, we've tried using weed whoppers, we've tried machetes, and it's impossible to deal with this stuff, right? Every day we're trying to figure out how to deal with it.
Dr. Janice Gilbert is a wetland ecologist who lives near Long Point and works for the Nature Conservancy of Canada. She has become a leading expert on Phragmites.
A bad day in a wetland is better than a good day in an office, except when I'm in Phragmites. I can't see where I'm going. It cuts you, it pokes you. It's like being in a sauna. But once I get in about 10 meters, it's like a dead zone. There's no evidence of wildlife whatsoever. No scat, no track, no nests, or native plants at all.
Phragmites originated in Europe, and how it arrived in Canada is unclear, with the first reported sighting in Nova Scotia in 1910. By 1948, it was in the wetlands of Ontario at Walpole Island, and has been spreading across the province ever since.
The seed heads have maybe 2,000 seeds on them. Not all of them are viable, but if you have millions and millions of seeds out there, there's a lot of viable seeds. I'd actually tracked the growth of the Phragmites, and within 4 days, you had almost a meter of growth with new shoots coming up. There aren't any wetlands down here that don't have Phragmites in them. It's just a matter of the degree of how extensive the Phragmites is. We estimate right now there's probably about 40% of dense Phragmites. We're talking about thousands of acres. So even where it's sparse, if we were not to do anything with it, that whole area would be gone in about half a decade.
Rick Luska is a cottager whose property is next to one of Long Point's biggest Phragmites infestations. He and his neighbors are determined to do something about the problem.
Right now, this is more personal for me because I've been here since 1955, and I can see what's going on. You could walk anywhere on these channels with a bathing suit on, a fishing pole, and back then I didn't even wear shoes or socks or anything. And you could walk anywhere here. And you try and do that now. You can just look down these channels, and I defy you to go fishing down these channels. I mean, we just cleaned this whole area up. I saw one mouse. That was it. There used to be snakes everywhere. There used to be turtles everywhere. You don't see that anymore. So this is a small step that we can do, but we need to get the people together, and we need to get the government on board, and we're gonna see if we can get this back to where it should be.
Rick knows his efforts are largely symbolic. Cutting alone won't kill Phragmites. Its long roots mean that these plants will regrow next year. But for the past decade, Dr. Janice Gilbert has been working with a retired farmer, Frank Letourneau, on a method to eradicate Phragmites.
This is an extermination process. We spray it, we roll it, and then we burn it.
Today, Frank is taking the first step to restore 90 acres of a Long Point wetland known as the Crown Marsh.
We have 3 machines, and you need 3 machines to keep 2 going. You have to have tracks because that frag plant will go right through a tire.
When we're dealing with coastal wetlands on a massive scale like we are here, we don't have mechanical methods. We have to use a chemical. I'm a wetland ecologist. I spent a lot of time in wetlands. It took me a while to get convinced that this was a proper way to do it, and I am now at that stage.
Right now, it is the only way to get rid of Phragmites. It's Roundup and soybean oil that we use.
They are low toxicity for humans, for wildlife, even bees.
And there is nothing in there but air and mosquitoes and ticks. There's no wildlife whatsoever. It's very sad to see the animals that I found in wetlands that got in there and have perished. I love cleaning them up and restoring them.
Long Point was first protected by hunters back in 1866. So it's not surprising that Frank's work here is being paid for by a local hunting organization.
Despite the fact that the Long Point Waterfowlers Association is perceived to be a bunch of duck hunters, when the annual general meeting a year ago was held, it was explained to them what an incredibly deleterious effect the frag was having on our beloved Crown Marsh. And they agreed that 50% of all the money we could raise should go towards eradication of Phragmites. And yesterday, it started, and it's the very first time that we've been able to apply a licensed chemical to the frag in the Crown Marsh.
The 90 acres being rehabilitated at the Crown Marsh is the largest attempt yet to tackle the problem. But it's a drop in the bucket compared to the thousands of acres infested with frag. But Eric Cleland, the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources biologist responsible for the marsh, has hoped that Long Point's past has prepared it to face this daunting challenge.
There's a long-standing tradition of battling these types of challenges with our local environment. Of course, the Norfolk Sand Plain was nearly a desert 100 or 150 years ago, and a lot of trees were planted to stabilize the soils and rebuild the forest cover here. It's resulted in the highest forest cover in southwestern Ontario, and that's something that we're very proud of here locally. And I see the same type of challenge with Phragmites. It's something that certainly we're willing to rise to the challenge for.
Having a World Biosphere Reserve overtaken by Phragmites, it's very upsetting, it's very disturbing, but what gives me hope is the amount of engagement by all the folks down here that really want to deal with it. I see light at the end of the tunnel.
We have time and time again proven that nature takes over and it comes back and replenishes it the way it's supposed to be.
In some ways, I'm optimistic, but no solution is long-term. So it's a bit of a mystery right now of how we prevent this plant from overtaking these sites.
We're not going to give up. We can bring this biosphere back to where it should be, because you saw how beautiful this place is.
Major funding for this series has been provided by the Nature Conservancy of Canada.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.